Hello, everybody. We'll wait for everybody to come into the room. Welcome, welcome. You're in the right place. If you're interested in women's representation and ranked choice voting and New York City, we're just waiting for a few more of the participants to join, and then we'll get started in a minute or so. Looks like the room is filling up. Great to see. Always good to see people interested in democracy and building a 21st century democracy. It's like popcorn in a microwave. You want to, as there people are popping, you want to keep it going. And then when it slows a little bit, we will actually start. Okay, why don't we get started, and I'm sure people will figure out the agenda as we go forward. So good evening, everyone. My name is Cynthia Ritchie-Terrell, and I'm the founder and executive director of Represent Women. Represent Women is a nonpartisan research and advocacy hub that's dedicated to building a 21st century democracy with inclusive gender balance at every level of government in the United States. We study the barriers women face in politics, and we partner with allies to advance the best practices to address those barriers so that all women can run, win, serve, and lead. Thank you so much for joining us tonight to learn about the experience of ranked choice voting in New York City, firsthand from those who played a key role in preparing for, as well as running in, and ultimately winning seats in New York City's historic majority women's city council. This gathering will leave us with a greater understanding of what the critical ingredients were for this amazing achievement, as well as what lessons we can take back to our own communities, and jurisdictions. I'd like to give a big thanks to Represent Women board member Anita Coward-Mayers, who played a pivotal role in planning and preparing for tonight. We really appreciate her time and the valuable perspective she brings. To start us off tonight, we're fortunate to be hearing from New York State's Attorney General, Letitia James. Letitia, Tish James, is the 67th Attorney General for the state of New York. With decades of work, she's an experienced attorney and public servant with a long record of accomplishments. She's the first woman of color to hold statewide office in New York and the first woman to be elected Attorney General. Let's roll the video.
Hello, everyone. It's Letitia James, Attorney General of the great state of New York, and I'm thrilled to be here to talk about one of my favorite topics, helping women to lead, because great things happen when women lead. I'd like to thank Represent Women, your president, Cynthia Ritchie-Terrell, and her entire team for bringing us together today and for all that you do to advance democracies and to break down barriers and help women lead. My thanks to Jessica Haller of 21 and 21. And I'd like to thank today's moderator, Katharine Pichard-Erskine, and our panel of unbought, unbossed, and unstoppable women leaders. They're all distinguished members of the New York City Council. Council members Carmen De La Rosa, Amanda Farías, Crystal Hudson, and Nantasha Williams. Now, women have always been leaders. We lead in our homes and in our places of worship and in our communities. We may have led indirectly and in subtle ways, but we have always led in fields that range from business to science, to politics, medicine, and to culture. And at this moment, we are taking our place as leaders in our own right. Yet, we still have so much more work to do. We are still fighting for our own right to make decisions about our reproductive care. We are still fighting to be paid an equal wage for equal work. We are still half the population of this planet, yet a fraction of the individuals in the rooms where it happens. And that is why our conversation today is so important. Last year in New York City, something magical happened. We elected the most diverse city council in history, and you are going to hear from some of the best of them today. We had so many firsts. The first Muslim woman on the city council, 2 openly gay Black women to serve on the council, and we're going to hear from one of these women today, my Councilmember Crystal Hudson. the first Korean American council member, the first Colombian American member, and for the first time in history, women will hold the majority of seats. Yes, women lead. And that didn't happen by accident. It happened thanks to a lot of activism, courage, and hard work. It also happened thanks to another first. New Yorkers used ranked choice voting that led to more candidates, more competition, more voters, and a government that is finally starting to look like the city it oversees. But we know that politics doesn't stand still. And now we need to talk about how to build on the success of 2021. And that's what today is all about. So thank you all for having this important conversation. And everywhere and always, let's hire women, pay women, support women, value women, respect, love, and nurture women. And yes, let's vote for women because we're here, we're fierce, and we're not going anywhere. Thank you.
Wow, great to hear from Attorney General James. She was hoping to be with us in person and her schedule kept going back and forth, as you can imagine, like all of you. She's such a busy woman, but great to have her. Warm welcome for this session tonight. The first woman and the first people of color were elected to the New York City Council in the 1930s, when ranked choice voting was first used in New York City. My husband's great uncle, George Hallett, and many, many others were involved in its early success in the city. Now, almost a century later, women are making history again on the New York City Council, thanks to organizations like 21 and 21, Common Cause New York, and so many of the other players that were instrumental in making sure that there are qualified women ready to run, prepared to run, and running effective campaigns. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Katharine Pichard-Erskine, who's a 25-year veteran of politics. She's president of the Hamilton Campaign Network, a leading Latino-owned and managed consulting firm, providing strategic advice and voter contact services for high-profile issue advocacy, community-based marketing, and political campaigns. Throughout her career, Katharine has developed a wealth of experience as an operative in competitive electoral races, as well as key political and issue campaigns. This experience, in addition to her diligent planning and spot-on intuitive insights, have made her a sought-after strategist and a regular political commentator on Telemundo and many other media outlets. I'll hand it over to you, Katharine.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that wonderful introduction. And I am so excited to see that wonderful message from our Attorney General, Tish James, who has made so many strides to advance women in the workplace and in electoral politics here in New York. So for those newbies that are here with us today who might not be political buffs, ranked choice voting is the electoral system in which voters rank candidates by preferences on their ballots. And certainly we experienced it in the 2021 cycle here in New York City. For the first time, we were able to get a majority women city council. So we see a very tangible result to that new system here in New York. As of January of this year, 2 states, Alaska and Maine, only have ranked choice voting for state and federal elections. And then other states have jurisdictions that have implemented ranked choice voting. So as your moderator, I'm not gonna talk a lot. I wanna hear from these amazing women that we have here on the panel. But we do wanna frame the conversation in terms of what went well, what we can do better, and certainly how we make it adaptable to other jurisdictions within our great state. So without further ado, I want to introduce Jessica Haller, who's the Executive Director of 21 and 21, someone who for many years has fought tirelessly for gender equity and a fair city. She was also a candidate for city office. So without further ado, Jessica, please kick it off for us.
Thank you, Katharine. Thank you, Cynthia and Represent Women for hosting this. Thank you, Tish James, for that, for kicking us off so well. And I want to pick up the story in around 2006. And one of my themes, I think where Cynthia started, is we all stand on the shoulder of giants. Women, giant women, we stand on the shoulders of giants. 2006, our New York City Council had 18 women out of 51 seats. So I believe that at the moment, at that time, 18 out of 51, if you do the math, it's not quite half, but it's not terrible. And we had our first woman speaker with Christine Quinn. And I think that at that moment, from what Speaker Quinn has said, there wasn't even a thought or a hope that focusing on equal representation in our council was something that we would even ever do. But then in the next cycle, we went from 18 women in the council to 12. And then when term limits were implemented, Melissa Mark Viverito, who was then speaker, turned around and said, oh my gosh, by 2021, if we don't do anything, there are only going to be 5 women incumbents in the council, 5 out of 51. So it was Melissa Mark Viverito partnering with Councilmember Elizabeth Crowley and Margaret Chin, identified the fact that we need to focus on supporting and getting women into the council to create equal representation. Now, to quote Cynthia Terrell, who's taught me so much, there are 2 parallel tracks that need to happen in a city or in a state to create the opportunities that we have here in New York. One of them are, we would call them democratic reforms or electoral reforms. And the other are what we need to do to support the women. So I have 5 different points of sort of what has to exist to create these opportunities. The first would be an ecosystem of organizations, of women and people supporting women that need to exist to be out there. What happened in New York City was an analysis of the ecosystem and the realization that nobody was focusing specifically on municipal elections in New York City Council. We had Eleanor's Legacy. We have Emily's List, at the federal level. We have Women of Color for Progress, which is started by one of our councilwomen, focusing on certain segments and certain races. We have Amplify Her, which was doing certain parts. We had Vote Mama, which was helping moms, but nobody was focusing directly on electing a majority woman in the New York City Council. I actually, in the theme of standing on the shoulders of giants, I want to quote from Bella Abzug's introduction in 1977 to the National Women's Conference. And one of the things she says then in 1977, that it is not one organization or any set of ideas or particular lifestyle. It's millions of women deciding individually and together that we are determined to move history forward. The women's movement has become an indestructible part of American life. And here we are, nearly 45 years later, still picking up that work and still moving from there. So create an ecosystem in whatever city or state or municipality you are in to support the women. The next electoral reform is matching funds. Matching funds program in New York City exists, matching donations up to $250, 8 to 1, which means so many candidates can go and ask their friends and family for $10. And that $10 becomes 90 because it's matched 80 from the city, and it becomes meaningful. So you pull more people in to get more involved, and it pulls down barriers for candidates who would be fearful of entering a race because of the expense. Matching funds comes with budget caps and spend limits, and it creates an equal playing field. The next reform would be term limits. Term limits in New York City opened up 35 seats out of 51. So there were 35 opportunities to engage. And in 2021 and 21 endorsed 74 candidates in 2 parties in 35 districts. And 25 of those women are in council today. And we used ranked choice voting to do so. So ranked choice voting obviously is the next reform that is absolutely critical. 21 and 21 leaned into ranked choice voting. The organization used it itself. The organization taught its members and the communities how to engage in ranked choice voting, how to use ranked choice voting. It encouraged labor, other electeds to use ranked choice voting in their selection of the candidates that they want to represent. Really, really, really important. What else did 21 and 21 do? Well, it brought women what they needed at the moment that they needed it. So when they needed training or encouragement to get off the bench, the organization was there. When they needed connection to labor or other electeds, it was there. When women needed mentorship to understand what they should be doing, to have someone to call in the middle of the night and say, I need help, the new organization provided mentorship. When the pandemic was ending and June was coming and people needed boots on the ground to be volunteers, the organization mobilized the membership and provided it. So all of the infrastructure that a candidate would need is important to provide and make sure that the candidates have it as they need it. What could have been done better? All of the organizations and all of the sister organizations, and I think Rank the Vote is on this call, were very much engaged in teaching and training communities in different languages and in different ways about ranked choice voting. I know the candidates themselves, I know I spent some of my budget, I know some of the council members on this webinar as well spent their own money training people on ranked choice voting. The cities need to take on that burden. My race was one of the first in the city to use ranked choice voting. I was in a special election on March 23rd of last year. When I came out with a public ranked choice voting agreement with one of my opponents, the CFB had yet to produce advice on how to spend money to promote your ranked choice voting agreements. So we couldn't do anything about it. If the city is going to do this, it needs to be out ahead of the elections to make the ranked choice voting most effective. Because I think, all told, a city or a government or a state can do that communication much more effectively than all of the civic organizations together. And I think we just hit on the movement. We are standing on the shoulders of giants. We are building a pipeline now. AG Tish James is so supportive of the work we do, and she also started her career in the council. Now that we have a council of 31 members who are women, we have a pipeline. Already, 2 of the endorsed ranked candidates from 21 and 21 are in the New York State Assembly. So it is the support, and it is growing the support, and is growing the pipeline that will get us to sustained equal representation. And really the vision of 21 and 21 is not just achieving gender parity in 2021, but generational change, so that we look back 20 years from now and know that 2021 was the first year that we did it, and we maintained it ever since. Thank you, Catherine. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate all of your comments, Jessica. And certainly, as I was writing some notes, I look at the ecosystem that has been built over the years. It is not something that happened in 1 year or 2 or 3. It's really a process that has taken many, many years, and we've stood on many, many shoulders, not just within the political system and the political process, but within business and mentorships in the nonprofit side. A lot of our amazing women who are elected now, we're heads of nonprofit organizations serving people in our communities, or coming from different walks of life. So it's very, very excited to get not only women to represent us, but a diverse group of women, as you mentioned earlier, that can really represent our interests. So with that, I would love to give an opportunity to one of those new members of the City Council who have joined us tonight, to give us her perspective in terms of ranked choice voting. And again, what we are analyzing here is what went well, what we can do better, and how we make it adaptable. And then certainly, I also would love to hear your thoughts on the pipeline that we are creating for this diverse group of women that not only could continue to grow the women representation within the council, but within other areas of government and industry. So Councilmember Crystal Hudson, if you would be kind, there we go. If you would be kind enough, what are some of your thoughts with respect to the discussion today, and particularly that ecosystem of women supporting women?
Yes, thank you, and good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for having me here with you. Ranked choice voting got us here in many ways. Certainly, it wasn't the only thing that got us here, of course, but I think it definitely played a role in electing a majority women city council for the first time ever. And I think what we saw throughout the campaign cycle was camaraderie and was collaboration in a way I think that you don't normally see on campaigns, within districts, across districts. I remember very early on in the campaign cycle, I wrote an op-ed about our disappointment in the budget vote back in FY 21, I think it was, fiscal year 21, that is. But in year 2020, with 6 other women who were all running for city council across various districts, 2 of whom at the time were in the same race. And I think that's just something you don't usually see, and certainly not with a majority of men running in these races. We talk to each other, we collaborate with each other, we advise each other, we console each other, and we share in so many of the experiences that happen on campaigns. And so, I'm really thankful to be in a city council that is majority women, and with so many friends and people who I know I will become closer friends with. I think there's just a camaraderie among women that is unlike any other, and definitely unmatched.
Thank you, Council Member. And, one of the things with that comes is certainly the other challenges, as you mentioned and Jessica pointed out. Matching funds was another big boost to us electing more women to the city council, because we know that women traditionally have challenges to fundraising. We can go through the data at the national level. Are there any mechanisms, in your view, that would be good to implement as we move forward to continue to make the system easier and more equitable for women to be elected?
Yeah, well, one thing I want to mention, and I'll look for the link to the article in a moment so that I can drop it in the chat, but the city wrote a piece about myself and a couple of other candidates who are all women of color, who were among the top fundraisers in all of New York City, across all of the candidates for city council, that is. So I just want to make mention that while, the national statistics may say one thing, we do have an ability to fundraise. And I want to just point that out, because so many of us work so hard and we're able to raise so much money. But I think ultimately the bottom line is that we have to make it easier for people like us to run for office. We have to make it easier for non-traditional candidates to run for office. And really, as long as you're not a straight, white, cisgendered man, you're considered a non-traditional candidate. I think Tish mentioned in her opening remarks, myself and Kristen Richardson Jordan in Harlem are the first 2 out gay Black women ever elected in New York City. We have to make it easier for queer candidates to run. We have to make it easier for women to run. We have to make it easier for working mothers and parents to run. We have to make it easier for people with disabilities to run. We have to make it easier for older folks to run. We have to make it easier for everybody who's, like I said, considered a non-traditional candidate. And that might include, systems and tactics like public funding, also like implementing, ranked choice voting, and so many other methods, to support folks. I think we're really lucky to be in New York City, where we have an amazing public financing system, which we don't even have throughout the rest of the state, right? That's just a city program. And I know that our state colleagues wish they had a matching funds program like we do here in the city. But we need to continue to implement these types of programs and resources, to everyone, so that more people who can really, make a difference in the way we legislate can have a seat at the table.
Thank you, Council Member. And one of the things just before everyone joined, Council Member, another pioneer, an amazing kick-ass woman in the City Council, Council Member Carmen De La Rosa mentioned is, the challenges that working moms face, not just as elected officials, but as candidates as well. And the funny story was her daughter screaming cupcakes on an IG Live. That's not something that most people necessarily who are elected in office in the past used to have to deal with. Yeah. But certainly as we have more and more women and more moms in the council and other offices, it's part of the culture of who we are, right? We are human and we are people after all. With that, Council Member Carmen De La Rosa, I would love for you to share with us, we've talked a lot about what we need to do in terms of continue helping women as candidates, but I know that you have some thoughts also on how we help the electorate learn about ranked choice voting and certainly participate in a way that continues to advance our communities. Because at the end of the day, we can't just leave it up to candidates to do the education process with our voting base. What are some thoughts that you have with respect to that? And how do we get voters more educated about ranked choice voting?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having us today. And it's a pleasure to see Crystal and Amanda and Nantasha here with us today. One of the things that I've talked about a little bit with ranked choice voting is the conversation about the Board of Elections reform that comes with it. I think Jessica said it in her remarks, but we can't expect for the candidates who are doing 300 things at once to be the only vehicle to educate our communities when it comes to ranked choice voting, or to have it be counted against us with the little bit of resources that we're able to spend on these races. My race was a race with 8 candidates. And so, everything was maximized, whatever money I had for a mailer or whatever money I had to do outreach for my palm cards, I had to do that times 8 because there was just so many candidates in the race. And so, every time we are thinking about how we spend our resources, obviously we're thinking about ranked choice voting. We're thinking about how to explain to people to, vote for you number 1. We spend a significant amount of time explaining that on a graphic, for example, on my palm card, but we can't be the only ones to do that work. There has to be a coordinated efforts with the Board of Elections, with other organizations across the city that are helping us to educate our communities. My community is a predominantly Spanish-speaking community. There was also very little resources for language access. It continues to be an issue in governing as well. But when it comes to elections, right, we have to make sure that we're using, for example, the ethnic media, having conversations with them to explain to them what ranked choice voting is. I remember at one point, I was trying to explain to a reporter what ranked choice voting was, and I didn't know how to say ranked choice voting in Spanish, right? So even myself, I had the challenge, and I'm like, voto por orden de preferencias. And it's like, yeah, I think that's it, right? And so it would have been good if the materials that were given out, were consistent across the board. We could explain it in details. There were some very creative videos that came out, but most of them were in English, right? And so definitely keeping in mind the communities that we have to empower and educate in order for them to be engaged in this process. Communities that oftentimes, we hear about the communities with the low voter turnout, right? But these are communities that have been historically and systematically kind of excluded and marginalized from even government itself, let alone elections. So that was a huge challenge for us. But we were able to actually get people to understand that there was ranked choice voting and how it worked. You know, I remember one of the things people would tell me, can I vote for you 5 times? And I would say, no, you can't vote for me 5 times. Your ballot will be disqualified. So literally, later on in the campaign, we learned that we put a little chart about, you know, that was like a sample ballot, and we would go around and just point to it and tell people, this is how you vote, you know, and that helped, right? It was a visualization of what ranked choice voting does. I saw some of my colleagues do very creative things. I think Amanda was one of the ones that I was following very closely. She was, you know, doing ranked choice examples of other things in life. That was great. Keeping people entertained, but also engaged in what you're doing, asking questions. The other thing that I would say about ranked choice voting is that there was, I think all of us probably had this. There was one debate that became very awkward because they asked you who you're going to vote for number 2 on your ballot. And in my case, I was the only person that responded to the question. So I was the only person in my race who was willing to say, I'm going to vote for this person number 2. None of the other candidates were willing to point to another person in the race and say, I'm ranking my opponent. And that just shows me that there's still a shift in ideology and in education, where we have to make sure that, you know, our communities understand that although we're competing against each other in a sense, there's still value in all of our stories, in all of our experiences, and that there's good things. And it's okay for me to point out the good things in the other candidates in the race also. I think it talks to the type of support that we should be giving women who are running for office across the board. Because as Jessica said, you know, some of those candidates might have gone on to be assembly members or senators or who knows, Congress members in the next session. And so we have to make sure that we are uplifting each other as we educate our communities as well.
Thank you, Council Member. And you make a really good point in terms of investing resources on the ground. You know, one of the greatest challenges in my entire political career was in the middle of campaign season 2020, having to basically rework campaign plans 5 times in the midst of the pandemic, trying to figure out how we were actually going to get to voters and get them out to exercise their rights. And so, you know, whether it became vote by absentee, and then certainly in communities of color, what we found was that folks still wanted to vote in person, whether it was through early voting or on election day. You know, we wanted to make sure that our communities didn't miss the opportunity, because we know the damage that can cause, right, in future elections when folks don't vote. So investing resources on the ground, educating the public about how to vote was a critical component of that election. And I think, again, in 2021 with ranked choice voting, it was something that we saw a great challenge with in terms of educating our communities. So with that, I would love to pass it on to Councilmember Nantasha Williams, who comes from the great borough of Queens, my favorite in the entire city of New York, which is where I am from. No offense to any of the other boroughs. So we're delighted to have you, another new member of the City Council, someone who's fought her entire life for social justice and who has been a community activist. Council Member, can you share with us some of your thoughts in terms of the discussion here? What were the things you feel went right? What went wrong? And what's next for ranked choice voting in your view?
Yeah, so I would start off with like what went wrong, which I just feel like in general, there could have been more outreach and communication around ranked choice voting. I feel like it was left up to us, the candidates, to educate the constituents around what ranked choice voting is and how to even like ranked choice vote. But I think it was a grand experiment for our city, or re-experiment rather, to sort of understand how to best leverage ranked choice voting to ensure that we're electing people that typically have not been elected in our city. For me, I'm not sure if it played a huge role in my race in particular, but I do think that I shift my campaign strategy from what it was when I ran for office the first time I ran for an assembly seat. And when I ran for the assembly seat, it was really a zero sums game, right? Like, you go knock on someone's door, they say they're not supporting you, you kind of like quickly remove them out of your universe because everything's like data crazy. So you quickly remove that person out of your universe and you kind of like never go back to them again, right? Because they said they weren't voting for you. So you're like, whatever, moving on to the next person. Let me get to my win number. Whereas this go around, I think it allowed for more robust conversation at the door. And it wasn't a zero sums game, right? So if someone said they were voting for someone else, it was an opportunity to continue the conversation and explain ranked choice voting and explain, you know, that's great that you're voting for that person, your number one choice. I would love to be your second choice if you don't have a second choice, and explaining what that meant. And I, as the candidate, I felt it was a little bit more sort of a warm, right, when you're engaging with people at their doors, because it wasn't, again, a zero sums game. Like, okay, you're not voting for me, cool, peace out, you know, like, I'll never see you again, you're out of my universe. Instead, you know, we kept certain people in our universe that maybe I wasn't their first choice, but, you know, maybe they committed to being my second choice. And so, you know, we would tag them differently, you know, in our system, but at least they were still a part of my universe. They were still a part of the group of people that did get a touch from me. Again, whereas previously it really was kind of like a wrap once someone said that they weren't voting for you when I ran for the assembly seat.
Thank you. And in terms of your strategy, you talk a little bit that you say ranked choice voting didn't really impact a lot your strategy. And as someone who worked with a number of candidates in different districts, it was something that was not one size fits all, right? Depending on the number of candidates, how competitive the election was. I did have a race in a district that we had 18 different candidates, right? And then there were others in which the number of candidates was less, but perhaps we're a little bit more competitive with respect to the backgrounds of the candidates. So our strategy for the most part was sell yourself first. And, you know, be out front in terms of who you are, and you are the number one choice. And then, we pivot at some point later in the campaign to do that ranked choice voting education. Did you start the education process from the beginning of your campaign, or was there a pivot? And I would love for any of the other council members here to comment on that, because I think strategically, as we continue ranked choice voting, that is really the what's next, right? How do we continue to obviously work within this electoral system so that we can continue to elect women up and down the ballot? So if anyone has any thoughts on that question and the strategy for ranked choice voting, I would love to hear your thoughts.
So for my race, we started off educating people. So I actually took lead on like organizing all of the candidates that wanted to be organized to like host ranked choice voting like info sessions for the district. And so we held a few of those early on. And then when I started knocking doors between myself and the canvassers, ranked choice voting was a part of like the talking point. Because we thought it was important to at least educate people and start that orientation. I didn't really start the conversation around, well, if I'm not your first choice, can I be your second choice, until like closer to the election, because I think things take time. So at the very last minute, there was a little bit more outreach and education, not just from candidates, but from, you know, the administration government itself. And so I think people started to sort of understand what ranked choice voting was, or that there's going to be a new way to vote. And so I started kind of having those conversations. And I would say one thing, again, just in terms of like the differencing in the strategy, is not making a touch point with a particular person like a zero sums game. And also one of the things I did, if I saw, we have lawn signs in Queens. I know other places in the city don't have lawn signs, but lawn signs still matter here just a little bit. And so when I saw lawn signs for other candidates, maybe they weren't in my universe, but if I saw a lawn sign, I would go to that house. Like I was a little aggressive like that, like, okay, they're not in my universe, but I see like another candidate's lawn sign. And so I would go to that person's house and I would like point out like, hey, I see you have XX candidate's lawn sign. Like, that's great. You know, I had like a thing that I actually genuinely liked about each candidate. And I really did have a really good relationship with like most of the people in my race. So I genuinely like really liked some things that each candidate would talk about. And so I'm like, great, you know, I really like their plan for our youth. I totally agree with them on that. Do you know we have ranked choice voting? Cool. Do you have a second choice? No, I would love for it to, you know, to be your second choice. And like some people actually appreciated that. So that was one thing that I feel was like a little aggressive that I totally would not have done. I would never go to someone else who wasn't in my universe and talk to them because I'm like, why? They're not here. Like, and they're not voting for me. So I would never go to talk to them. And as a person who is a lover of democracy, although I don't think we live in a functioning democracy, I think it's always important to engage as many people as possible. We just never really have the resources to do it, which is why there is a whole industry around campaigning and a whole methodology around it, because it's how do you get your message out with limited resources and limited time. So I appreciated that it was still worth my while to cast a wider net because there was ranked choice voting.
And to engage those voters that, like you said, perhaps weren't as in tune with the options that they had. So it was an opportunity to educate about ranked choice voting. Thank you very much for that, Council Member. And now I would love to introduce from the great borough of the Bronx, Council Member Amanda Farías, who I know did a lot of education around ranked choice voting in her race, as was previously mentioned. I will tell you, Council Member, that at one point I did have Councilmember De La Rosa come to me and said, oh, look, this is what Amanda is doing. We should do this too. So she was definitely very impressed, as was I, by your efforts to engage our communities. So please tell us a little bit, and you know, obviously we're going to go back to more specific points, but I do want to give everybody an opportunity to give us some general overview with respect to ranked choice voting. What went right, what went wrong, and where do you think we go next?
Yeah, I mean, I think what went right in my race was the education piece that I took on as a responsibility as a candidate running for public office, and really wanted to engage my constituency. You know, that I appreciate Councilmember De La Rosa's highlight and your highlight of the fun different ways I was trying to tackle the very new process of voting for my constituency. So we did ranking our favorite restaurants and favorite chocolates for Valentine's Day, which I feel is a setup because every bodega in my community has like Ferrero Rochers right at the counter. And that's the one that won. And it's a conspiracy to me. I'm like, there's no way this is the best chocolate. Reese's peanut butter cups are the best chocolate. But we tried multitude of ways to really engage people in the process so they can understand on small scale in their everyday life applications of how they could rank things in comparison to getting the voter guide or getting mailers and evaluating candidates based off of their values and what they felt true to the people they want to represent their community. So I think that's what went right in my race or in the RCV education that I was committed to doing, because the challenge we did have was that the city wasn't committed, or some of the larger organizations that have pushed for RCV to be implemented citywide weren't as committed to understanding that on the hyper locality of each of our communities, we had a multitude of languages of people that were committed to voting, but didn't quite understand or weren't going to be able to get the education needed to actively be engaged in a ranked choice voting election cycle. And so a lot of us had to take on that responsibility. But as you can see, with 31 out of 51 council members, people were committed to doing that education piece, to working with other members. It's really great to hear Councilmember Williams also partnered up with other people. I partnered up with 2 other candidates in my district because my predecessor had lined up people in my race to partner with his candidate to run an active RCV race against me. And so with that challenge in our race, we reached out to other candidates who were open to working with me, even though I was the front runner, and making sure that the community knew who was in this election cycle to represent their values, to represent their voice, and to educate them on the process that had the best foot forward for community, not just for the title or for their own, self-aggrandizement. And so partnering up with other people to focus on the Black African-American community in my district, to focus on the Bengali community in my district, making sure we were educating folks in a multitude of languages. I had mailers out that were trilingual, which was difficult because dialects and interpretation of dialects are different for everyone, and finding that common language. It's easy for me to look at a piece in Spanish and say, that's incorrect. But looking at a piece of mailer or literature in Bangla, you need a bunch of eyes on it because I can't tell what's wrong or what's right. Those were some challenges that we were able to overcome because we partnered up with other candidates and were able to be as inclusive as we possibly could during the selection cycle.
That's great. It's really encouraging the creativity around trying to engage our communities. I think that for all of us, it's what we fought for our entire political life. So thank you for sharing that with us. With that, Cynthia, and listening to all of these amazing women, I wanted to kind of bring it back to you briefly to share any thoughts that you want to make sure we discuss with folks who are watching at home. What are some of your thoughts based on what you've heard?
Well, I think so many of the points that the council members have raised are so critically important. Everything from very effective voter engagement and voter education in multiple languages is key. I completely agree with that, as well as education that's accessible to those with a range of accessibility accommodation needs. I think that's awfully important. I think the combination of a group like 21 and 21 and Common Cause New York and the Rank the Vote and the other groups that were working in New York to really try to share messaging and share communication strategies. It seems to me that that's awfully important also as we fine tune this exercise in democracy of ranked choice voting. And I'd be curious to know from council members what they felt when they were, we've talked some about the sort of the mechanics of it, election administration angle of it, and the education and all of that, that's important. But I'm wondering what messages seem really resonate with the council members. And I mean, given that we have such a sense of the big picture about how ranked choice voting is helping to engage more voters and increase turnout and elect more women and people of color, I'm wondering which things seem to resonate best with constituents when you were going door to door or speaking at events. I don't know whether people want to go around in a circle on that. Councilmember Hudson, do you have thoughts on that in terms of messaging?
Yeah, I can start. I think, it seems to really have varied from district to district. Where some districts, I, for example, have a very highly engaged, high voter turnout district. And so, people knew about ranked choice voting not everybody, of course, and I still had to do some education on my end, but a lot of people knew about it. They had been following, and, would ask when I would knock on their doors, would ask like, what the difference was between me and some of the other candidates, and tell me, that it was between me and another candidate for their first choice, or that, I'm definitely their first choice, but what did I think of the other candidates for the rest of their rankings and things like that. But I know and recognize that varies from district to district based on, voter engagement and access to resources. So my message was really similarly to Nantasha. Even if I knew somebody was, or if they told me, that they were definitely voting for somebody else, or thinking about strongly considering voting for somebody else, if we had made a call to that person and it was in our notes when I'm on the doors that they said they were voting for somebody else, I would still knock on their door. I wouldn't, avoid them. I would still knock on their door, and I will say, I just want to introduce myself. You've got all these options. I just want to tell you why I think, I should be your first choice. And if not, why you should consider putting me as your second or third or fourth or fifth choice. And that always went over really well with folks. I think, one example I can give quickly is, I had a constituent ask me one time what the difference was between myself and another candidate. And I told her all of the things that made me, different from that candidate. And then she said to me, I asked that candidate the same exact question, and all they did was say negative things about you, and you didn't say a single negative thing about them. And so I'm going to be voting for you. And, for me personally, not only did I, run a campaign that was rooted in love and care and honesty and integrity, but, I think people also really valued through this process, positive messaging, and, not slinging mud and talking negatively about, other candidates in the race, because ultimately, we're all running together. We're all running for the same thing. And, and I think when you have 5 slots to fill out, people don't necessarily want to hear negative things about other candidates. They want to know, like, why should I put you first, right? Or why should I put you second? What's the differentiating factor between a first slot, candidate and a third slot candidate? But like, I don't necessarily want to hear negative things, because I've got to put all these people somewhere on my ballot, So that was some of the stuff that I heard on the doors that I thought also just made the experience. I mean, I had a really tough and negative race, but made the experience in some ways, and at sometimes a little bit more pleasant.
That's great. Yeah, of course, that aligns with what we hear from other jurisdictions which have used it as well. That sense that it can take an election cycle or two for candidates to get accustomed to it and familiar, and for the voters as well, and endorsing organizations and the whole ecosystem. But once that kicks in, there's a great story from Betsy Hodges, the former mayor of Minneapolis, echoing those same things, and from Libby Schaaf, the mayor of Oakland, and woman after woman who's run in jurisdictions with ranked choice voting has highlighted about that same theme. I believe Councilmember Farías had her hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with everything that Crystal was saying. I just think that another point that I found with messaging around ranking and order and really like community values was helping people understand what the ranking actually meant. A lot of people felt like, oh, well, it's just going to go to my number 1 anyway, and it's not going to be movable. And I think what was really important in my community was helping explain that there were some people that really, really, really felt it was important to vote, for example, for the Bengali candidates that were running, because representation matters, and they wanted to give their community a shot. They wanted to feel like they had to put their people, their community members who are active and engaged and fighting for their voice and bringing their voice to the table every single day. on the ballot as their first choice. And that didn't mean that I wasn't also actively engaging them and saying like, you should totally put those people first or 1 and 2. But that doesn't mean you don't consider me for 3. And I think what RCV was able to give us is that opportunity to say, here's where we all align on those same values or those same issues or those same viewpoints, and what we're committed to doing together, whether whether we all win or one person wins or comes in second or not, we're still committed to community. We're still committed to working together. And so you should totally put your folks 1 and 2 or number 1 and put me as 2, because here's where we align. And I think RCV and the education piece towards it, of really being able to understand why ranking and what ranking meant to different identity groups in our communities was really important, because there were folks that felt committed to their community member on the ballot, just as much as I'm sure a lot of Latino people felt for me, or we had Bengali folks in the community that were like, we've uplifted this person into leadership and we want to see them do well. And that made total sense to me. So being able to use RCV as a tool to say, I'm just as committed. You've been working with me for years. You know, I'm committed to the community too. Like, let's work in partnership to do 1 and 2, or put me as number 3, really shined bright during the election cycle.
And that sometimes requires a little bit more education, right? Which goes to the initial point of needing more resources to go through that entire process. But it's also about candidates, right? Being able to profile themselves in that way. And to what was said earlier regarding negative campaigning, we all see that whenever there is a negative campaigning on the part of a candidate, yes, perhaps they could knock the other person a few notches based on whatever the attacks are, but that negativity also has a blowback effect, where the person who is doing the mudslinging also has a negative impact. So what we've seen, as Cynthia said, over and over in jurisdictions where RCV is implemented, is that it does promote that more of a positive campaigning, less of the negativity, because folks don't want to turn off voters that maybe could put them as number 2 or number 3 or even number 5. So, Councilmember De La Rosa, I think you also kind of had your hand up. Was there something that you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I think that colleague said it so well, but it was just about choice at the door, right? You would go up to a door and you would knock and you would pitch yourself, and the person would say, well, there's five opportunities to vote here, and you would say, well, it's your choice, right? It's your choice, you decide. Because people would ask me, I think Amanda was alluding to this, like, if I don't, rank you number 1, and if I don't rank all the rest, what happens? Do I lose my vote? If you don't win, is my vote invalidated? People had a lot of concerns about invalidated votes. And I think it's also a symptom of having an affidavit ballot situation in our communities. When the books were purged a few years ago, we had a lot of people that, just were no longer showing up in the books. And there was some trauma there from this broken process that we see. And so people were really scared about their ballots not being counted or their votes not being properly counted. So it was an opportunity, one, to educate people, to let them know that they have a choice, right? They can rank me number 1, me number 2, me number 3, however they saw fit. It also allowed for unusual allies, because there were people who really, really did not like somebody else in the race, and they otherwise probably would have not considered me. But because they really didn't like somebody else in the race, they actually ranked me on their ballot. Right? Things like that did happen. It allowed you the opportunity to have a conversation with someone who might have been just shut off, had it been a one-on-one race, or had it been a non-ranked choice voting race. And so choice was the main message at the door. And it was a great experience as far as explaining it to people, although there were some challenges.
Yes, and so with that, I think that for the most part, there's a positive experience with ranked choice voting here in New York City. Certainly, we elected more women in the council than ever before, and there were other components like matching funds, for example. But as we look at what's next, I would love to talk about two things. One is the pipeline, right? How do we get more women elected at all levels of government throughout New York State, right? And can ranked choice voting outside of New York City work? And then certainly, I do know that even within this cycle, there were some labor unions and other opinion makers that used ranked choice voting when they endorsed. Can we translate that into educating more voters to get, how to use it? So in terms of what's next, Jessica, do you want to talk a little bit about that? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So we 21 and 21, we created a slate so that if you were voting in a district that had a lot of women and promoting women was your issue, you can bring your slate into the polls or use it when you're filling out your ballot. So just like Councilmember De La Rosa said, if you want to crowd out your ballot with people who believe in your issue, so Vote Pro-Choice did the same thing. They created ranked choice slates for the whole city, and they sent them out on Senate so you can, fill in your ballot. But I think the problem was it was the opposite. The unions did not lean in to ranked choice voting. By the end, some of the local electeds did start to lean into it, but it was hard for them to figure out, what am I saying? If I'm a state senator and I'm endorsing two people in this race, what does that mean? Two is it one and two? And then if I'm a candidate, how do I explain that to people? So I made up little icons. I was like, rank number 2. Nobody knows what that means. So it's for the civic organizations to provide the candidates with what that means, and to get more and more and more of the unions, of the other electeds who are engaged, the thought leaders who are engaging in this, to use it when they're helping you, right? You look to this person because you want to know who they're voting for. So how are they voting? How are they lining up their ballot? I guess the other thing on the future,
can we get New York State ranked choice voting? Do you think?
There was discussion about matching funds. We're going to have 6-to-1 matching funds in the state in the next cycle. So that, that's coming. I think that it's a marketing issue. I think that it's like, oh, I used to just vote and now I have to ranked choice vote. You're still voting. It's a packaging and user experience issue. And I think that what we need to do is package our experiences from New York and California and just throw the information and research like from Represent Women and the other organizations and help seed these efforts across the country, and would love to continue to participate in that.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
We're excited about that too. And I just, it's so true. You hear stories from Jean Massey in Minneapolis, or stories from, out in the field at county fairs and in states all over the country, in Maine and Alaska, where it's intuitive for people to have a first choice and a second choice and a third choice. They just need to get a little of a nudge, a little bit of encouragement to figure out how to apply that to politics. But I think once they get over that little bit of a hump, like, of course, I've got a favorite flavor of ice cream, I think it makes a lot of intuitive sense. So all of those kinds of interactions at food markets and fairs and rank your favorite band or whatever it might be, I think all those will help normalize ranked choice voting and make people realize we do this all the time in our daily lives. So I think that's an important point to make.
So on that, Cynthia, and we have a question from the chat. What is the strategy for bringing ranked choice voting to other New York municipalities after New York City? Do you see that as the greatest barrier to other localities, the education piece? Or what is it that you think is preventing other localities from implementing ranked choice voting?
That's a great question. I'm not the best expert on that, but I do know from jurisdictions around the country that it's often a combination of things. You have to have the right setup, whether it's a charter commission that might be considering an electoral change, or you have to have an interest in the legislative or elected body. It's helpful to have election administrators who are well versed in ranked choice voting and voting equipment that can handle a ranked choice voting election. Fortunately, we have a lot of those things in place now in New York State and in much of the country, where we've got the technical resources available, as well as the investment from leading foundations and individuals in making sure that we can do good messaging and education and mobilization. And I know that groups like Rank the Vote and Fair Vote and a whole host of other organizations are working at figuring out, working from the state level, the city level, the county level, to expand the use of ranked choice voting. So I think so far the results are really encouraging, and we'll just see in the coming election cycles which cities go next, which states go next. It's kind of an interesting ping-ponging around the country to see, will Minnesota be the next state? Will Virginia be the next state? Who knows who the next state will be? I did, if I may, Catherine, have one quick question that always intrigues me, and then I wanted to open it up for 10 minutes or so of audience questions, if there are some.
Yes, absolutely.
As a student of the impact of having a more reflective democracy and people who are impacted by policy having a seat at the table, helping to make decisions, I'm curious what the council members think are a couple examples, or maybe just one example, of a way in which it changed the decision-making process or the consideration of policy to have so many women on the council. Like, was there either a process-related story or narrative, or something that happened related to policy that felt different because there were so many women to be talking about the issue with?
I can just speak about my own experience. In thinking about the process, I guess just really quickly, I'll say that it feels like, at least, being with the city council being led by a woman, who happens to be a mother and a grandmother, it feels like, members have more of a say, I would say, in some of the processes, or like there was real thought and consideration put into our committee assignments. For me, as an example, I was assigned as chair of the aging committee, and I spent 8 years caring for my mother, who had Alzheimer's disease, and have been an advocate for older adults for a long time. And so it just felt like a really great match. And I know for some of the other members on the line and throughout the council, there have been some real close alignments with our personal stories and our appointments, which I think, generally is much more likely to happen with a woman at the helm. But I think, for me, I just recently had my first resolution and first piece of legislation that I introduced in the city council, which was a resolution calling on the state to pass and the governor to sign and fully fund the Fair Pay for Home Care Act. And I think anything pertaining to home care, or caregiving and the care economy is, dominated by women. We have 400,000 home care workers across the state, the majority of whom are women, are people of color, and are immigrants. And, my mother was somebody who received care and benefited from home care. I know Councilmember De La Rosa's mother was someone who provided care as a home care worker. And I just think about the rally that we had for fair pay for home care, and it was all women. It was myself, it was Councilmember Carmen De La Rosa, it was Councilmember Alexa Aviles, whose mother-in-law was also a care provider, a home care worker. And, it's our stories, it's women's stories, it's caregiver stories, and just care stories in general. It doesn't matter really what end of the spectrum you're on, whether you've received care or you've provided care, or you have a loved one who's received or provided care. But just talking about caregiving as a whole, is something that we haven't seen in the past with majority men, in the city council. And so that's just one example that I can think of when it comes to policy and decisions, the way we're making decisions, who we're talking to, how the experiences that we're taking into consideration, how we're making decisions, and also our lived experiences. Women have different lived experiences than men do. And so we're bringing all of those experiences as care providers, for our loved ones, whether they be our children or our parents or anyone in between, spouses. Those are all of our experiences and experiences that we are historically, in the majority of providing. So I just wanted to share that, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That's a very powerful impact story in terms of how we see the end results of having more women in decision-making positions. Councilmember De La Rosa, you popped up. Did you want to add something to that?
Well, I just popped up in solidarity of Crystal because we had that experience of having to honor both our mothers, right? Her mother who received care, my mother who gave it. And it seems like this is happening throughout, right? We as women are also supporting one another in our respective leadership roles. As chairs of our committee, we're uplifting each other. And so I just popped up to appreciate and honor my colleague.
That's great. Just for everyone's information, there was a question on the chat. Will someone explain the details of ranked choice voting and how it impacts the national popular vote interstate compact? There are some resource links that were put on the chat for everyone from Represent Women on ranked choice voting and some process-based resources. So please do take a look at those links for additional information so that you can get some of those answers. With that, I think we've answered most of the questions that were posed. Thank you to all that were watching. Any of the council members wanted to add anything to the discussion? We do have about 10 minutes or so. And then that way we give an opportunity to anyone else to ask other questions.
Well, I just want to add, since we're all here, that we're also the first council that has now I think 11, 12, 13 mothers. We just had 2 council babies in the last, I think, 2 months. The 3 months. Our colleague Jen Gutierrez from Brooklyn had a baby, and our colleague Julie Wan just had a baby. And just thinking about motherhood and how we support one another in this work is so important. And I think it's something that also has impacts when it comes to running for office as well. I know the first time I ran for office in the assembly, I had to take my daughter out of childcare, because my daughter was 1.5 and I needed to take a leave of absence, an unpaid leave of absence, to run for office. And I remember having to burden my mother, who was also working, to say, help me care for this child while I, spent hours on end convincing my neighbors that I should be the candidate, and having no childcare, having no access to childcare. And I think about how that conversation has actually changed and progressed since then, right? And now we have things like the ability to pay for childcare using campaign funds, right? It is because women run, because we bring our lived experiences, that this progress is able to be made. And so that's exciting for me. And I always think of things through the lens of my child. And I always tell Catherine this funny story about my daughter. She came home from school one day and she said, Mom, guess what? So-and-so's mother doesn't have a campaign office. And she's like, I thought all mothers had campaign offices. And I said, Mia, they all should have campaign offices. So just the fact that we are, making them understand that this should be the norm, not the exception, and they're growing up in that world, it means a lot to me.
Or when you say, sorry, baby, it's campaign season, and they respond, when is it not campaign season? So in terms of forward-thinking strategies, and we talked about the ecosystem, right, of women supporting women and the impact of some election reforms like matching funds. Are there any pieces of legislation or reforms at the administrative level that any of you ladies are pushing to bring to the next stage of ranked choice voting? Or is that something coming soon from Jessica Haller? Jessica, you have to give everyone a cheat sheet of policy priorities so that we can all be there rallying with you. One question that came up on the chat is, what are your favorite examples of things to have people rank? For example, ice cream, fair foods, brands, and especially things that are relevant across race and people groups. And I know Amanda got us started with that idea, Carmen, which you mentioned. So why don't you start by telling us what you would like to rank, and then we can go around the room.
All right. Well, my favorite ice cream is chocolate, so I'm not even gonna ask anyone to rank that because that's just the answer. It's chocolate. But let me see. What's your favorite day of the week, excluding Saturday and Sunday? There you go.
I like that. For me, I would probably have to say Friday. Councilmember Crystal Hudson, can you share with us, what would you like to rank?
I think books. Favorite books could be last book you read in order. Yeah.
And what is your favorite book?
Well, I think depending on, you know, the day, the month, the occasion, there's a different first choice. And the thing I will say, the thing I appreciate about ranked choice voting is the fact that I hate being limited to favorites. I hate having to choose just one thing or one choice. So I will say, you know, I really enjoyed Samuel Stein's book. I can never remember the name of it, but it's about zoning and planning in New York City. And that's something that I think is like a go-to for everyone, especially here in New York, if you're thinking about development and how our city is shaped. So that's the one that I'll go with, and I'll find the name of it right now.
Councilmember Williams, can you share with us what you would like to rank and your favorite?
Music genres, perhaps. Just like different music, maybe like favorite songs, I don't know. And right now I don't have a favorite song, but I have been really, really obsessed with South African music. This Amapiano, which is like, you know, South African music has a lot of different iterations of like house, but like the new iteration of house is something called Amapiano, and I'm like, we're really obsessed with that music.
Excellent. Super excited to listen in. That might be my listening to music tonight. Jessica, do you want to share with us what you like to rank?
Yeah. As part of the candidates needing to educate constituents, I'm a mom of 4. And one of my campaign videos was a video of my children ranked choice voting their stuffed animals who were running for council of the play area or whatever it was. So the penguin, the blue bunny, and that, and we had ballots, and it was part of the video and the educational message that we sent out. So I think Humongous Bunny ranked 1, and Humongous Bunny is a humongous bunny.
I will tell you, I popped up on my memories a picture of my daughter when she was about 4 years old with one of those huge carnival style bears with rainbow stripes that my brother-in-law won for her at a local festival. and it was probably 4 times her size. When it arrived at my house, it sat on the couch, and I said to myself, what am I gonna do with this thing? Let it hang out for about a week or two. And then it made it out on garbage day. To this day, my daughter's 14, she still remembers Rainbow Bear. So just as, doesn't matter how big they are, please do not get rid of it. Cynthia, what would you like to rank?
Wow, I'm a big gardener, so I guess I would have to say maybe either favorite vegetables or favorite flowers. That seems a little bit bland, but truly, I think a lot about flowers. So I think I would go with that.
And what is your favorite flower?
Oh, good question. I'm really liking my grape hyacinths, which are blooming in my garden right now. They're small, they're fragrant, they're reliable, loyal. They come up every year. They seem to be a good pollinator. So all good around there.
Excellent, excellent. Love to hear that. So for me, I love ethnic foods. So whether it is Dominican food or Puerto Rican food or Mexican food. Oh no, wait a minute. I'm talking about Latin foods. So, so I would say probably my favorite is Dominican food, which is from the Dominican Republic. But I love all kinds of foods, and I always find that food brings us together like nothing else. It's about understanding each other in a way that's real, and so I'm excited and thankful to be part of this panel. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for inviting me, because it reminds me of what a great meal looks like, right? You have diverse ideas, great conversation, and a lot of juicy information so we can move forward with this great electoral experiment of ranked choice voting. So I'll pass it on to you to close us out.
Sure, and I just saw that my great friend Jean Massey, who's really led the work for ranked choice voting for decades in Minneapolis to great success, Minnesota, has a question about the extent to which RCV influenced your decision to run. We don't have too much time now, but I just wondered if, I think we've heard from some of the candidates and from Jessica, but just a 30-second answer as to whether you were impacted by the existence of ranked choice voting when you were considering running for the council members.
I'm happy to start. I was not influenced by RCV to run. I kind of announced pretty early on in 2019 that I would be challenging the incumbent that was coming in. Early enough on before it was kind of rolled out into the city, but it definitely influenced how I would approach the other candidates in my race and the community and education to make sure that we were running a campaign that was as inclusive as possible in my race. So great. I can pass it on. Can I kick it off to another member?
Yeah. Yep.
We lost you to the mute button.
Yeah, I can jump in. I wasn't influenced to run by ranked choice voting. You know, once ranked choice voting was announced, I thought it was great and thought about the ways it might benefit me, but it wasn't a determining factor in my decision to run.
Gotcha. Anybody else before we close out? All right. Am I missing anybody raising your hand that I should be seeing? No, I don't want to cut anybody off. All right. Well, thank you, Attorney General James and Catherine and Jessica and Nantasha and Amanda and Carmen and Crystal for sharing your expertise with us tonight. And of course, to Anita Coward-Mayers for helping to organize this fantastic event. As Jessica said, women now make up 61% of the council, as we know. And while there are many factors that led to the success, we know that the RCV helped to elect more women because it does a few things. It eliminates split votes among like candidates. It incentivizes civility. It fuels issue-focused campaigns. It reduces campaign costs when eliminating low turnout and costly second round runoffs. And it encourages endorsing organizations to support multiple candidates, all of which strengthen democracy. As Katharine mentioned, ranked choice voting is used by the states of Maine and Alaska, by military and overseas voters, by the Academy of Motion Pictures, by political parties to select nominees in over 50 cities, from Oakland to Salt Lake City to Santa Fe to Minneapolis to Cambridge to New York and many places in between. Women make up 43% of mayors in jurisdictions with ranked choice voting, compared to just 25% in non-RCV cities, while women make up 51% of councilors in jurisdictions with ranked choice voting, compared to just 30% in non-RCV cities. The team at Represent Women is excited to partner with allies in the democracy reform and women's representation communities to expand the use of ranked choice voting and to build a package of reforms, including public financing and candidate recruitment, pipeline work, as Katharine referred to it, creating open seats and voter education so that we can reach gender balance in politics in our lifetimes. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, and stay tuned for an invitation to our next webinar, which will be held in May and will be on the topic of election administration. So thanks, everybody. Really appreciate everybody's time this evening.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you,
Good
Katharine, for
evening.
Good
moderating.
night. Bye-bye.
Hope our
Thank you.
paths cross soon.